Yosef Chaim Brenner is the third of the three thinkers we are discussing as representing the secular, national view of Jewish identity. He too was sharply critical of Ahad Ha'am's claim that Jewish national identity required adherence to certain ideas, values, texts and traditions. We will follow Menachem Brinker, however, in distinguishing clearly between Brenner and Ahad Ha'am. Let's begin by highlighting some key points in Brenner's biography. Brenner was born in 1881 into a poor family in what is now Ukraine. Showing great promise as a Talmud scholar, from the age of 9 he was sent away from home to study in a number of yeshivot. It seems his father had hopes that this talent would lead to him becoming a prominent rabbi, perhaps raising the family out of poverty. Like many intelligent, talented, intellectually curious yeshiva students of the time, he began to read works of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, and works of the new Hebrew literature. Eventually, this activity and his criticism of Jewish tradition led to his leaving the yeshiva and a break with his father. In 1901, he was conscripted into the Tsarist army. This exposed him for the first time to non-Jewish society and to radical revolutionary currents in the Russian Empire. Brenner was an unworldly and not very practical young man, and life in the rough environment of the Russian army was difficult. Even so, Brenner at this time took the first steps in establishing himself as a Hebrew writer. In 1904, rather than serving in the Russo-Japanese War, he succeeded through a dramatic escape in deserting the army. He made his way to London. Brenner lived in the East End of the city, like many poor Jewish immigrants of the time. Ahad Ha'am lived in London at the same time, but in the fashionable West End of Bloomsbury, near the British Museum. Brenner's friend Asher Balin recounted the story of an invitation to visit Ahad Ha'am, which turned out quite disastrously. Brenner and Ahad Ha'am were opposed not only ideologically, but also socially and temperamentally. In 1908, Brenner left London, and after some time in Galicia and Germany, when he had the meeting described by Berdichevsky, quoted at the beginning of Brinker's article, he set off for Palestine. After failing to adapt to the life of an agricultural laborer, he settled first in Jerusalem and then in Jaffa. During the First World War, Brenner was hired as a teacher by the Gymnasia Herzliya, which was the central cultural institution of Tel Aviv, the first modern Hebrew city. We will return later to Brenner, the school teacher. Brenner's life ended violently as he fell victim to the anti-Jewish riots in Jaffa in 1921. He is buried in a common grave with the other victims of this unrest in the Trumpeldor Cemetery in Tel Aviv, the same cemetery in which Ahad Ha'am is also buried, along with other literary figures of the period, including Bialik. Brenner was above all an artist, a writer of stories and novels, principally in Hebrew. While he lived quite an itinerant life, often without settled employment or income, he was seen, even in his lifetime, as an important literary figure. By the act of settling in Palestine at a relatively young age, he is identified with the pioneering spirit of what is called the Second Aliyah. He had a turbulent personality. He did not shy away from conflict and controversy. This often took the form of articles for the Hebrew press, including the journal Hapoel Hatzair, the Young Worker, which he edited. He was an inspiration to many of the young pioneers of the period in his championing of the centrality of productive labor and his radical approach to many questions, including the matter of Jewishness. His attitude to the Jewish future was pessimistic and uncompromising. He considered Jewish life in the diaspora as essentially doomed. Jews in the freer societies of the West would inevitably give way to the attractions of assimilation. He considered Jewish life in Eastern Europe in an even dimmer light. He saw that Jews were engaged in small trading, which doomed them to being both unproductive and poor. He considered the traditional religious leadership to be generally intellectually and morally bankrupt. If there was to be hope for a continuing existence for the Jewish people, an existence that has worth, there will need to be a transformation in Jewish existence. This possibility, and far from a certainty in his eyes, existed in the establishing of a Jewish national existence in the land of Israel, founded on productive labor, with a renewed cultural life founded on the Hebrew language. This renewed Jewish existence would give rise to a culture. Jewish culture is not a preconceived set of values, texts, and forms of life. It is rather what the Jews as a national group produce and do in practice. In this, he is clearly at odds with Achad Ha'am, but as Brinker points out, he also differs from Berdichevsky. For Brenner, both Achad Ha'am and Berdichevsky overestimate the role of ideas and texts in the actual life of a people. One focus of these differences was their attitude to the phenomenon of assimilation and even conversion out of Judaism. For Achad Ha'am, this was due to the absence of a secularized Judaism, which was nevertheless continuous with the Jewish past. For Berdichevsky, this was due to the narrow conception of what being Jewish might contain. For Brenner, assimilation was people doing what comes naturally, with the opportunity to escape the sufferings and humiliations of diaspora Jewish life. Conversion to Christianity was merely an extension of assimilation. Brenner is therefore associated with an ideology of Shlilat HaGolah, the negation of the diaspora, an ideology that saw diaspora Jewish existence as inherently unhealthy, invalid, and not viable. Brenner's confrontation with Achad Ha'am was expressed in its most strident form when, in November 1910, the 29-year-old Brenner published the article in Hapoel Hatzair which launched what became known as the Brenner Affair. The article, which appeared under a neutral title of a review of the journals and literature of the year, had the subtitle "On the Prospect of Conversion." This short article, published under a pseudonym, sparked a massive backlash, and few reacted more strongly than Achad Ha'am, who was one of its targets. Brenner's first claim was that conversion was not in itself a significant phenomenon. It was simply the next step taken by those who had already lost their sense of belonging and commitment to the collective of the Jewish people. Much more controversial was Brenner's argument that in any case, as a secular, nationally defined Jew, the ideas and beliefs of Christianity were no less worthy of consideration than those of Judaism. As an atheistic secular Jew, he claimed to be equally indifferent to both. For many readers, this putting Christianity on a par with Judaism and the New Testament on a par with the Hebrew Bible was a scandal. Brenner attacks the idea that the Bible should enjoy a privileged status in the library of the new Jewish culture. There are, he wrote, better and more significant books. In the next clip, we will see the provocative way in which Brenner expresses this view.